When an eyewitness of the paranormal shares their story, they are often accused of looking for attention, wealth, or fame. But what happens when the witness is already rich and famous? What would be the point in fabricating a tale that could make them look ridiculous, damage their credibility, or even harm their career? Well, that's what makes tonight's case so compelling. Actor Telly Savalas had nothing to gain and everything to lose when he shared his own frightening paranormal encounter. It wasn't spun for fortune or fame, he had those already. It was a simple confession of the utterly unexplainable, an incident that scared the hell out of him for the rest of his life. Tonight we do a deep dive into a little discussed celebrity experience that will make your head spin and your flesh creep. An ordeal that stretched far beyond one single encounter, but into a further incident that is barely discussed and yet had bizarre connections with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Brace yourself for a wild ride down a lonely road as we explore the ghostly encounters of Telly Savalas. If the name doesn't ring a bell, his face, or voice, might. Telly Savalas was an actor known for his deep, gravelly tones and cool demeanor. He played many parts, but was best recognized for his role as the tough, lollipop-sucking detective in the 1970s crime drama Kojak. Long before he became a household name, though, Telly had an experience so bizarre and unsettling that it would haunt him for the rest of his life, in all senses of the word. He shared his story in an interview with the Australian TV show The Extraordinary on September the 26th, 1994. A lot of the online discussion about this incident stems from that interview, but the segment does have some information gaps, which I think I've managed to fill through digging into records, newspaper reports, and more. I'll share those later. But first, let's dive straight into his chilling experience. A brush with something or someone from beyond the grave. A ghostly encounter that unfolded on a stretch of road in the dead of night. This life-altering incident happened in a suburban-style neighborhood within the city of New York. The year was around 1958, 1959, and Telly was out on a date with a beautiful young woman. They'd had a great time, but now the date was over, and he had dropped her off. He was heading home. It was late, about 2 a.m., as he drove back to his home in Long Island. Yet there was one thing he hadn't done. He hadn't checked the fuel levels. Soon enough, he looked down and realized he was running out of gas. This happened to me once. I was driving a car which had a faulty petrol gauge, and so I had no idea I was on empty until the car started jerking and struggling, and it rolled to a stop right in the middle of a busy London street, at rush hour no less. Not a great moment. For Telly, however, there wasn't heavy traffic, it was so late, and so he let the car roll to the side of the road, sighed, and stepped out wondering what his next move would be. Thankfully, he wasn't in the middle of nowhere, and he could see a White Castle restaurant within walking distance. White Castle is a regional fast food chain in the US. They sell shakes and burgers and are often open 24 hours a day. So he walked up to it and went inside, asking one of the workers there if any gas stations were open nearby. The guy inside said, "Yeah, there is, but you're going to have to walk through the woods to reach it. Once you're through those, you'll get onto Grand Central Parkway, then walk up that to Cross Island Parkway. You'll find a gas station. They'll sort you out." Relieved at the news, Telly thanked the man, headed outside, and he could see the woodland near the road. Thankfully, it didn't turn out to be a thick forest or anything. It was just like a wooded area, and so he headed across and walked towards the trees. As he walked, I'm sure he was hoping that they sold empty gas cans too, because he didn't have one in his car. This is the moment when everything changed, and all it took was a few words. Telly was about to head into the wooded area when he heard somebody speak. A strange, high-pitched voice, possibly female, said, "I'll give you a ride." Telly turned to see where the voice was coming from. He assumed the speaker must be on foot because he didn't hear the sound of a car, just a voice. But when he turned round, he saw a Cadillac car waiting right there on the road. Odd. He didn't see the car earlier. He certainly didn't hear it pull up, but there it was. And sitting behind the wheel was not a woman, but a man. And this man was wearing a white suit. The man spoke again. "I'll give you a ride." Telly said this man's voice was striking. It really was just so high-pitched. He described it as, quote, effeminate. But no big deal. It was a stranger offering to help him, and he really needed the help, so he genuinely appreciated the offer. Telly came a little closer, leaned toward the car and said, look, that's really nice of you, thanks, but actually I need to get to the gas station. I've run out of fuel. The man beckoned him inside the car, said he was happy to give him a lift to the station and back. So Telly climbed in, full of thanks, and the kindly but peculiar stranger drove Telly to the station. And as they went, the driver was talking to him. He described the conversation, Telly did, as nice, apart from that eerie tone to his voice. Now, I've checked into the street names and locations that Telly shared. I've pinpointed roughly where the gas station would have been, or perhaps even still stands. Grand Central Parkway and the Cross Island Parkway intersect just on the edge of Queens Village in New York. Checking the maps, there are several stations there. Well, they arrived and Telly hopped out of the car ready to buy a fuel can and fill it. But then he started checking his pockets. Disaster. He didn't have enough money for this. The strange driver noticed all of this and spoke again. I'll lend you $1, he said. Yeah, $1. Fuel was cheaper back then. Now, Telly didn't want to ask him for money. Around that time, he'd been working in radio. He'd done so since the end of World War II. He hosted a show for the US State Department called Your Voice in America. And he moved on to host a show called The Coffee House in New York City. So he wasn't broke or anything. But in that moment, he really was actually broke. He had nothing. And if he didn't accept this charity from a stranger, he'd be stranded tonight. So Telly said, look, I'll take your money, but will you please write down your address and your phone number so that I can mail the money back to you, because I am very embarrassed about this. The driver agreed, handed him the $1, and Telly bought a fuel can and filled it. All good. The stranger sat waiting for this all to be done patiently in the car. All paid up, Telly came back, climbed inside, and the driver started the engine. They headed back towards Telly's abandoned car. It was as they were driving that this stranger said something, a phrase that struck Telly totally random and out of the blue. The man said, I know, and then he said the name of someone. Telly never actually mentions the actual name in that interview, but it does turn out to be a real person. I think Telly might have been being sensitive to the man's identity, but after some digging, I think I've figured out who this man was, but we'll get to that in a while. The point is, in that moment, Telly did not have a clue who the stranger was talking about, who he was naming. So Telly said, oh, who's that? I don't know that name. The driver said that this person was a baseball player for the Boston Red Sox. Talk about random. Neither of them had been talking about baseball this entire time, so it struck Telly as odd for the driver to suddenly announce that he was a personal acquaintance of this ball player he'd never heard of. So it was awkward. But no, it was more than that. Telly said he made a point of this. It was the way the driver spoke about this player. His tone of voice, his demeanor was, well, to use Telly's word, spooky. And so Telly was spooked. But you know what spooks my body and brain? It's realizing I've gone through an entire day without drinking enough water, which is why I keep my hydration on track with Holy. Unlike Coke Jack and his lollipop, Holy is packed with flavor and electrolytes, but without all of the sugar. You see, we know we should drink more water, but plain old Tapoline, as my dad used to call it, can be boring, and the alternatives are rough. Sugary soft drinks, artificial tasting iced teas, and energy drinks that'll make your heart pound more than a ghost encounter. That's why I think Holy works really well, and I'm delighted to partner with them because they make my hydration easy. My go-to flavor so far is the coconut hydration drink. It is so nice. It tastes like a pina colada, but I can have it at breakfast time without my family judging me. And as well as hydration drinks, they do some amazing iced teas filled with vitamins and fiber, plus healthy alternatives to energy drinks with slow-release caffeine to avoid those jitters. And check out the cool bottles from Holy. You just fill them up, shake them, voila, you're drinking water, but you're actually into it. If you want to try it, you can sample different flavors with the Starter Set Deluxe. Comes with a groovy black or metal shaker. This thing keeps drinks cold all day. Plus, you can get £5 off with your first order with my code FOG5, then use code FOG to get 10% off every order after the first. Just use the link in the description. Well, getting back to Telly, he may well have needed a few real pina coladas for what was about to happen to him next. Well, they finally arrived at Telly's car, which was a big relief because I'm sure the star was keen to just get back to his house on Long Island. So they parked and Telly got out and put fuel in the tank, but he said in his interview that he couldn't get the car started without a push from the stranger. Now at this point I got a little confused because when I ran out of petrol on that fateful day in London, I just did the walk of shame to the petrol station, bought a can, filled the can, brought it back and filled the tank, and I was off. While all the car horns were screaming at me. But I was able to just start that car with no push, so why did Telly's car need pushing? And I thought, aha, is he exaggerating here? This is a sign that this whole thing is just made up. Well, to check, I looked into American cars in the late 50s, and sure enough, those older cars have different fuel delivery systems. There are multiple reasons why he needed a push and I didn't. For example, modern cars have electric fuel pumps that work as soon as you turn the key. But cars of the 50s had mechanical pumps that only operated once the engine was running. In other words, it needed cranking or pushing to get the fuel flowing again. So it does track, after all, that he asked the stranger for a push. The stranger agreed, stepped out of his car and walked to Telly's car, and the two of them pushed while Telly turned the ignition, and eventually his car sputtered back into life again. Once the engine was running, Telly turned to the stranger and was profuse in his thanks. I appreciate your help so much. The lift, the money, the push, thank you so much. He was genuinely grateful. I mean, I would be, you would be. And so they said their goodbyes and Telly drove off and headed back home to Long Island. And apart from the fact that this man gave off an incredibly spooky vibe, particularly his voice, Telly just reflected on the journey home thinking, what a lovely thing for a person to do for another person. The next morning, he got up for work at the radio station, I presume, but I can't be certain. And in the afternoon, he just happened to pick up a newspaper. It was the New York Journal-American, which was published between 1937 and 1966, so it tracks that he picked that one up. He opened it, flicked through, and was suddenly struck by one of the stories. A baseball player in his 20s was dead. And he couldn't believe it as he read it. The name mentioned was the very man the stranger had talked about last night. Telly was quite shaken by this. In fact, he described the experience as frightening. And so Telly went home and chatted to his mother about it, saying, look, this is spooky. I met a creepy man last night. He said he knows this player, but the player's actually dead. She was open to the paranormal and said, look, there's a supernatural world, son. Strange things happen. Maybe the person you met last night was some kind of spirit or ghost. Telly was pondering this huge claim when suddenly he had a revelation. The money. He owed the driver $1, and he had specifically asked for the address so he could send it to him. He raced for his clothes from last night and pulled out the pockets, and there it was, a handwritten note from the stranger with a name and address on it. And he read it, and it turned out that the driver's name was Mr. James Cullen. And next to the address, Mr. Cullen had also written his phone number. Telly was so curious about this, he grabbed the phone and called that number. And it went through to a place called Jimmy's Bar. What you're about to hear is a reconstruction of what Telly said happened in that phone call. And it's startling.
Hello, Jimmy's Bar.
Hello, may I speak to Mr. Cullen, please?
Hello?
Mr. Cullen.
Who's calling, please?
May I speak to Mr. Cullen, please?
He's not here.
Well, when do you expect him?
Who is this?
Well, I was with Mr. Cullen last night. He gave me this telephone number, and he said that I could reach him here.
Listen, you son of a bitch. I don't know what you're talking about.
I just want to speak to James Cullen. He helped me.
You're talking about my husband, and he's been dead for 2 years, damn it.
She hung up. And Telly just sat there staring at the phone in disbelief. This can't be right. It just can't be. And yet he was so perplexed by all of this, he said, I am not letting this go. No way. And so he called her again. And eventually he managed to persuade Mrs. Cullen that he wasn't joking around. He was deadly serious. He had met a man called James Cullen who had given him this very number. And Telly said, please, can we meet? I've got to get my head around this. She eventually agreed. In fact, she came from Boston to meet him in New York. So they really were taking this seriously. And when they met, he told her all about that night, and he shared more of the details of what had happened, including the detail that James Cullen was wearing a white suit. When he said that, Mrs. Cullen recoiled in shock. She said, "Really? A white suit?" He said, "Yeah." "Why?" She looked at him and said, "He was wearing a white suit when we buried him." The atmosphere of that moment must have been electric, as Telly gave her gave himself space to get his head around it. And then he suddenly remembered the scrap of paper that James had written his details on. Now, he had told her about this letter on the phone, and so they had arranged for her to bring a letter from her husband so they could compare the handwriting, She pulled out her letter. It was the letter that James had written to her while he was in the army. He'd signed this letter not from James, but Jimmy, which was the name she knew him as. The writing style was identical. It was scary. All of the details of this were matching, apart from one important one. It was when Telly described Jimmy's unmistakable voice. He couldn't stop himself from bringing that up. He said, "Look, this man in the car, he had a very high, kind of strained pitch to his voice. Frankly, he sounded almost feminine," he said. This is where Mrs. Cullen shook her head and said, "Well, that can't be right then. Jimmy always had a very deep voice, just like yours." Telly Savalas was famous for his low and commanding tone. Well, this was confusing. Everything else was matching apart from this, until he asked her how James Cullen had died. She took a breath and opened up to him. She said, "Actually, he took his own life." Telly was deeply sorry to hear this news, but he turned cold when he asked her how Jimmy had done it. She said, "Well, he'd taken a gun and shot right there, right through the throat." For him, this was a mind-expanding and yet frankly terrifying experience. He said he was never one to naturally believe in the paranormal. His mother was into that stuff, but he wasn't a superstitious person until that night, until this moment. And he was open about how it made him feel. In the interview, he said,
"Which scared the hell out of me. And for something like that to happen to me is something that I can't understand to this day."
That first experience on that night is particularly fascinating because there are lots of legends of phantom hitchhikers where someone picks up a hitcher, then later is told that the person they drove with was actually dead. And so people give a ride to a ghost, so to speak. Yet here it's very different. It appears it's the dead person who was driving the car. And not only that, this spirit is hardly fleeting. It sticks around. It helps physically. It gives out physical money that is accepted at the gas station. It writes its name and address on a piece of paper. It's like this figure was fully present for the time it took to help Telly on his way. Well, in a chilling twist, this wouldn't be the last time Telly encountered this strange man. And what happens in the next incident is wild. But before I tell you about it, let's not forget there is a third man in this story. The baseball player. Who was James Cullen talking about that night? So who was the ball player? Well, this is where we have to do a bit of digging. I looked into the players for the Boston Red Sox at this time period, and I couldn't find any player in their 20s who had died in 1958 or 59. However, I did find a player for that team who had died in his 20s, but earlier. Harry Agganis played for the Boston Red Sox from 1954 to 55. In May of 55, Harry was diagnosed with pneumonia. He came back to play for the Red Sox for 2 games against Chicago. However, when the team arrived in the next city where his third game was taking place, Harry was struggling to breathe. He said he had congestion in his chest. He couldn't stop coughing. And he was sent back to hospital for more tests, and sadly his condition just plummeted. Harry Agganis died on June 27th of 1955. But he didn't die in 58 or 59. Does that mean Telly Savalas was mistaken then about the year? Remember, he said he saw the newspaper report on the ball player's death the day after the encounter. So why would a newspaper be reporting on the death of a sportsman 3 or 4 years after the event? It doesn't make sense, frankly. Well, it's true that in the interview with the Australian TV show, Telly seems a little unsure of the exact date of the event.
God knows how many years ago. Let me think now. 58, 59. It's a lot of years ago.
Is it possible, therefore, that this phantom car ride happened in 1955? I've seen some paranormal writers who say it must have happened then, because that's when Harry Agganis died. However, there's one detail I think that challenges that theory. I looked into Telly Savalas' marital history. He married his college sweetheart, Catherine Nicolaides, in 1948. He was still married to her in 55. This is important, because can you remember what Telly said he was doing on the night of the strange encounter? He was out on a date. Why would he be so open about being out on a date with a woman when he was still married to Catherine Nicolaides at the time? It's possible, I suppose, but I think unlikely. Indeed, he remained married to her until 1957. He then got remarried to Marilyn Gardner in 1960. This means that Telly Savalas was divorced and single in 1957, 58, and 59. So to me, it is very plausible that he was indeed dating in the years he stated, 58 and 59. Especially because in the interview, he mentions just a little detail that after his night with the man in the car, he says he went home to speak to his mother about it. I discovered that he was actually living with his mom during those divorce years, so in my mind it all fits together. I think he stated the years correctly. This happened to him in 1958 or 59. Which still leaves the question. Why would the New York newspapers be talking about a Boston player a few years after his death? It's a potential weakness in the story, you might think. Well, I thought that too, until I did some further digging, and I found out something fascinating. You know, one of the reasons I'm so grateful to the people who sponsor these episodes is because that money helps me afford to not only run the channel, but to have access to certain research materials. And so I used some of the sponsor money for this episode to get me access to the American Newspaper Archive. And what I found was eerie. You see, despite the fact that Harry Agganis died in 55, I found multiple stories in various newspapers from both 58 and 59 with his name in the title. Why? Because following his death, several events were set up in his honor, including the Harry Agganis Memorial Dinners, a scholarship, the Harry Agganis Memorial All-Star Game. These articles would talk about the late baseball player and how his example was inspiring to others long after his death in 55. In other words, it is entirely consistent that Telly Savalas picked up a newspaper and read about Harry Agganis' death, even in 58 or 59. Yet this hardly clears up the mystery, does it? We still have these three men. How are they linked? Because at first they all seem totally disconnected. Telly Savalas, a living New York-based celebrity. James Cullen, a dead man with a grieving widow. And the baseball player Harry Agganis, a popular sports legend who came from Lynn in Massachusetts but had passed away. Well, there are links between them when you look at the details. For example, is it any mistake that James Cullen's wife traveled down from Boston? It's reasonable to think that James Cullen lived there too before his death. Harry Agganis played for the Boston Red Sox. Before that, he was a star player for the Boston University football team. In fact, Agganis chose to live in the Boston area not only because of the sporting life there, but he chose to live close to his widowed mother. So there is a strong geographic link between the two dead men. Maybe they knew each other in real life, after all. But the fact that Cullen said all of this in the present tense is what makes it strange. If Cullen really had known Agganis in everyday life in Boston, wouldn't he have said, "I used to be friends with Harry Agganis, the ball player, who's no longer with us"? No. He said, "I know him," in the present tense. Did these two men know each other in life, or somehow were they becoming acquainted in the afterlife? It's a lot to get your head around. It's also really interesting to learn that both Telly Savalas and Harry Agganis were of Greek origin. Is that just a random coincidence, or does it explain why Cullen mentioned his dead Greek friend? Because his new friend standing in front of him was also Greek. Who knows? Whatever the case, there is another part of this story that hardly anyone seems to talk about, but it is a disturbing postscript that has a connection with the assassination of a president. Telly had shared the story of this mysterious driver at various points in his life. Apparently, he spoke about this on the Michael Parkinson show in Britain, for example, on September the 28th, 1974. But as hard as I tried, I couldn't track a copy of that down. I've heard he may have even mentioned the name Harry Agganis in that interview, but I'm not sure. So if anyone knows that, please let me know. But like I said earlier, the core source for this story, and for the internet in general, is his September 26th interview with the Australian show The Extraordinary in 1993. Now, sadly, Telly actually died just a few months after that interview in January 1994. And upon his death, The Extraordinary show decided to do a follow-up episode about the star. They wanted to honor him after his death, and so they re-showed the Ghost Driver segment. However, they also had kept behind some extra footage of him that they didn't show the first time around. You see, when they originally interviewed him, he shared his story of his encounter on the road, and it seemed like that was the end of it, and they started shutting down the cameras. The producers of the show, however, were so struck by the story and his sincerity in telling it that they couldn't stop themselves asking more and more about it. They were just so fascinated, as you would be. And as they talked to him, they started to realize that this wasn't the end of the story, far from it. So they pressed him, and he finally agreed to tell them more. And they fired up the cameras again, and they listened. He said that a few years after the car incident, Telly was playing golf with some friends in the San Fernando Valley in California. It was November the 22nd, 1963. The friends were the game show host, Dennis James. At the time, he was a regular panelist on an NBC quiz show called Your First Impression. The other friend was Merrill Heater, TV producer who made shows like Hollywood Squares and Gambit.
This has been a Merrill Heater, Bob Quigley production.
The three men were playing a round of golf at El Caballero, which is a beautiful private country club. It was built only a few years before, in 1957. As they approached the tee of the sixth hole, from far away, Telly heard a voice. And it was a voice that turned his blood cold. He turned to see who it was, and he saw a man standing on the top of a hill. And this man was calling out to him,
Telly! Telly!
Now, Telly admitted in an interview that at that point he started shaking because he knew that the voice was horribly familiar. It was the man from that night a few years earlier. That high-pitched, effeminate tone that had spooked him so much in the dead of night was now drifting across this plush, beautiful golf course, calling out his name. Well, the man didn't walk down the hill towards him or anything. He just shouted out, Telly. It's funny, because when it comes to the sound of this man's voice, even if you do an impression of it, it sounds like ridiculous and stupid in the moment. Telly, Telly. But just please think about it for a moment. You meet a stranger and he consistently talks in this kind of almost like theatrical, spooky tone. In reality, it would be pretty disturbing to hear someone talk like that. Well, the man didn't walk down the hill towards him or anything. He just shouted out his name, Telly, followed by the weirdest sentence. He shouted this.
Did you hear what happened in Dallas?
Telly was like, what? He turned to Dennis, the game show host. He said, Dennis, do you hear what he just said? Dennis said, well, I could hear him shouting over, but I'm not sure what he's talking about. Telly knew it was just this random phrase about something happening in Dallas. Well, the three men decided to play on, but Telly was, frankly, afraid. He knew that this was the man from the car that night, but why was he here, and what the hell was he talking about? Well, after playing more holes, they decided to head into the clubhouse to grab something to eat. They sat down at a table and noticed that the television was running. They ordered food, when suddenly the TV show that was playing, a soap opera called As the World Turns, was suddenly interrupted.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News. In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first report...
It was Walter Cronkite, the long-running news anchorman who has become known as the voice of America for a certain generation. He was announcing the assassination of John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. Telly Savalas just sat there dumbfounded. They all did. The news of the president's assassination was a massive shock in itself, obviously. But the strange man back on the fairway had shouted over at them about 90 minutes earlier by Telly's estimation. Now, this is fascinating, and I had to kind of attempt some maths to try and figure it all out. Given that Los Angeles operates on Pacific Standard Time, the timeline appears to be as follows. 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time, JFK is shot in Dallas. 10:40 a.m. CBS interrupts As the World Turns with Walter Cronkite's first bulletin about the shooting. 11 a.m. Pacific. JFK is pronounced dead, but the public is not informed yet. (11:38 a.m. Pacific Time). Walter Cronkite announces Kennedy's death. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official. President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Time, some 38 minutes ago. Telly said that strange man spoke about Dallas 90 minutes before Cronkite announced the shooting at 10:40 a.m., which puts James Cullen's announcement about what was happening in Dallas at 9:10 a.m. That is well over an hour before John F. Kennedy was even shot. This is an astonishing claim. Well, what's particularly intriguing is how Telly ended that extra part of the interview. He admitted that James Cullen returned at other times too. In fact, Telly got uncomfortable, didn't want to talk about it. The producers had already pushed those JFK details out of him. So he just said to them,
That's only half the story. I'm not going to tell you the rest. It doesn't end there. I wish the hell it would. But as I say, to happen to somebody like me is... I don't comprehend. Because if 2 don't make 4, 2 and 2, it startles me.
And so Telly Savalas died from bladder cancer only a few months after this interview on January the 22nd, 1994. He was diagnosed in 1989, 5 years earlier, but despite the early diagnosis, he delayed getting medical attention, which let the cancer progress. His dad died of bladder cancer too, and his older brother had recently been treated for it, and his brother encouraged Telly to get treated, but he didn't. He'd been ignoring the first signs of the disease, blood in his urine. All 3 men had been heavy smokers, which is the number 1 cause of bladder cancer. Telly Savalas passed away at Sheraton Universal Hotel in LA. He'd been living there, and he died only 1 day after his 72nd birthday. The screen legend, known for his warmth and effortlessly cool voice and demeanor, was gone. Though, when you consider his remarkable story about the man in the Cadillac, it makes you wonder if anybody is ever truly gone, just because they happen to have died. His gravestone includes this quotation from Aristotle. "The hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways. I to die, and you to live. Which is better? God only knows." Telly doesn't appear to have tried to exploit this experience for fame or fortune. He already had those things. He simply told his experience as he remembered it. Because sometimes when the unexplained happens, you have no choice but to acknowledge it and share it. Though sometimes it's too traumatic to share, and he couldn't bring himself to share the whole story with people. I wonder if he shared that part about JFK because he could sense he was getting towards the end of his life and he was willing to be more open about it. I don't know. All I know is that Telly Savalas was a man whose most famous role, Kojak, saw him solving mysteries. But in the end, he was left haunted by a true life mystery of his own. What do you think of this mystery? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Pick it apart if you need to. Or if you can, bring new perspectives. Maybe you might even have more evidence that I'm not aware of. But until next time, maybe we just have to remember one simple thing. Next time you're driving, make sure you fill up the gas tank. I'm Peter Laws, and you've been listening to The Ghostly Encounter of Telly Savalas and the chilling JFK connection. Good night.